time to rebind The Hobbit into this interactive leather-bound edition. So I have rebound The Hobbit several times before, and every time I make one, my sister says to me, it would be really cool if the Hobbit door opened. So it was time to finally make that happen. I used this illustrated edition of The Hobbit for this. It's the same as from the box set that I used for my Lord of the Rings rebinds. I'm going to make this one kind of complementary to those, but not matching. So it's not really part of the same series. And I'm going to go through my process step by step as to how I made this book. So the first step, as always, is to tear off the original cover and then prepare the text block. So I started out by sewing my end bands for this one. To make it a little easier for myself, I marked the center of each signature with this masking tape. This purple masking tape is for like fragile applications, so there's not very much adhesive on it, which means that it removes from the paper without damaging them. Marking the center of the signatures when you're sewing the headbands just makes it a lot easier. You don't have to search through the book for the center every time, and since you're aiming for the center of the signature when you're sewing, it just makes it a lot simpler of a process. So I made the base for my end bands. I made this out of some leather cording, and then I just used the tissue paper method to hold it in place. Makes sewing a lot easier. And then I'm going to use this really pretty kind of shiny silver and blue thread for the end bands for this one. So my Lord of the Rings set everything was gold, so I used a gold ribbon and gold foil for the designs. But for the Hobbit, I thought I would do it in silver, so that's why I have a silver ribbon, and then I'm also using silver in the end bands as well. And then it was time to do some paper marbling for my end papers. So I started out by preparing the paper that I'm going to use. What I'm doing here is just applying an alum and water solution, and this just makes the paint stick to the paper. And then I let that dry before doing my marbling. So I'm using silver and black for the end papers for this one. I also made a whole bunch of other colors on this day, but this is the one that I'm going to use for this book. I also marbled both sides of the piece of paper, and then I let those hang to dry, and then once they're dry I iron them, and then they are ready to be used in the book. And it's time to get my case ready, so I cut out the design for the case on my Silhouette Curio, and then I have to finish the cut by hand because it is not able to cut through this 2mm chipboard. I saved that center piece because it's going to be the base for my Hobbit door later on. And time to make the door. So it's already the right size because I cut it out of that piece of chipboard to begin with. So I used this tiny little hinge that I had just in my crafting collection, and then I cut out into the chipboard an indentation so that it'll fit perfectly in there and that it will sit flush and you won't see it once the book is finished. I'm going to make sure it's going to work properly. And then I glued in that hinge, and then I assembled the case with the spine and the back piece as well. I just tape these together for when I'm applying the leather so that everything is in the right position. And then it's time to apply the leather. If I did this again, I would not trim the leather quite so close around the door. I would have a little bit of overlap going onto the back side of that piece of chipboard so that when I covered it with my end papers in the end, it would kind of hold it all together. I don't think it's going to come apart. It's glued in there pretty well, but I didn't think of that till after. I think it would just make it a little bit more secure. Instead, I just trimmed it really, really neatly and precisely. Once my case was done, it's time to make the Hobbit door look like a Hobbit door. So I used these wooden coffee stir sticks for this. They're actually wood, so I like it because it maintains a little bit of the wood grain look. Makes it look a little bit more realistic. I glued these onto my chipboard piece that's already the right size. And then I'm going to paint this green so that it looks like Bilbo's door. I used watercolor paint for this. It's kind of like a stain, so it maintains that wood grain look through the paint. And then I also added a little doorknob, which was just like a bronze bead that I had, but I didn't film that part. And then it was time to cut out the design for the covers. So I designed this in Adobe Illustrator on my iPad, and then I imported it into Silhouette Studio to cut. As you can see, I have some really tiny lettering for this one, so I was just thickening up the lines a little bit so that when I cut it out on the foil, you would actually be able to see it. And then I cut this out using my Silhouette portrait on some silver metallic foil heat transfer vinyl. Time for weeding, which is a pretty slow process. I had to be careful around all those tiny little details and those little letters. Carefully align this on the case, and then I use my Cricut Heat Press Mini to stick this to the case. I used to use a regular iron and it just doesn't work as well. So if you're having trouble with heat transfer vinyl, I think you just gotta bite the bullet and get the heat press. Since I had to do things in a bit of a different order because of the way I wanted to have the Hobbit door opening for this book, I haven't attached my end papers yet. Usually I would do this at the beginning before I even sewed the headbands, but for this one I'm doing it now. So this is the back end paper, which is one of the marbled papers that I made. So I glued that onto the back, and then I applied the mold to the spine. I didn't glue it around the sides of the end papers yet. I will do that later. And then I needed to align and create the front end paper. So this end paper was going to be visible when you open up the Hobbit door, and I'm going to have some writing on it. It says There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Tale by Bilbo Baggins. So I had to make sure that this was all aligned perfectly so that when you open up the door, you would see it perfectly aligned in the center. So I used my Silhouette Curio to draw this design on the end papers for me. And then I just added in the punctuation by hand. And made sure that it's all aligned. And then I'm going to fold this end paper the other way around so that that part is in the middle and you won't actually see it. To finish the Hobbit hole, I just put a little bit of velvet on the back and then I just burned it around the edges just to get rid of those frayed edges. I really liked how this felt. It made it feel kind of premium. And then this circle around the Hobbit hole door, I just used some wood veneer that I had. So I glued that in with contact cement. And then it's time to do the front end paper. So I drew a little circle where my design is on the other side so that I could line it up really, really well. Then I held it in place and glued it on. I haven't trimmed the end paper yet. I'm going to do that afterwards. This allowed me to kind of make tiny little adjustments to the positioning before I cut it to size. And once I knew it was in the right place, I glued them all on a little bit better to hold it in place, and then I trimmed it to size. And then it's time to do the actual casing in. I let that dry, and then it's time to glue in the Hobbit door. So I cut out the end paper around the Hobbit hole, and then it's time to glue it in. So I used some contact cement for this. I needed to use a really good strong glue so that it would hold when it was being opened and closed with the hinge. The hardest part was letting this dry before I played with it. I really needed to make sure I didn't get any glue in the hinge and just glue the whole thing shut. So I let it dry for a couple of days and then I tested it out and it worked perfectly. And I think it's so cute. And then the last step is I apply the lettering to the spine. I always do this at the end because it's so much easier to get it centered and straight if you have already cased in the textbook. And here's my final product. I'm so happy with how this one turned out, and I can finally tell my sister that the Hobbit door does in fact open. Thanks so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it.